The Soviet artillery officer, standing in the observation post near Vitebsk on the morning of June 23, 1944, could see through his binoculars the German defensive positions that his guns would bombard in approximately 1 hour, positions the German forces had spent 3 years fortifying and the German commanders believed could withstand any Soviet offensive that might be launched against them. The officer was checking range cards and confirming firing data one final time before the bombardment began, understanding that the accuracy and intensity of the preliminary fires would determine whether the infantry assault that would follow could break through German defenses or would be repelled with catastrophic casualties, as so many previous Soviet offensives had been when attacking prepared German positions. Through the binoculars, he could see individual bunkers, machine gun positions with their firing slits, visible as dark rectangles in the concrete, and the wire obstacles that stretched in multiple belts across the approach routes that Soviet infantry would use when the assault began. Operation Bagration, named after the Russian general Pyotr Bagration, who had fought against Napoleon in 1812 and who had been mortally wounded at the Battle of Borodino, represented the Soviet Union's summer offensive for 1944 and was designed to destroy German Army Group Center, which defended the Belarusian salient that protruded westward into Soviet-controlled territory. The operation's timing was coordinated with the Allied invasion of Normandy that had begun on June 6th, creating a two-front crisis for Germany where forces could not be shifted from east to west without exposing critical positions to overwhelming enemy attacks. Soviet planners understood that German strategic attention was focused on Normandy and on the threat of Anglo-American armies advancing into France, and they intended to exploit this distraction by launching the largest Soviet offensive operation of the entire war against Army Group Center at the moment when German reserves and attention were directed elsewhere. General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky, the two most successful Soviet commanders of the war, coordinated planning for Operation Bagration during April and May 1944. Bringing extensive experience from previous operations and understanding what tactics worked against German forces. The planning emphasized achieving overwhelming superiority at points of attack through concentration of forces, using deception to mislead Germans about where main efforts would occur, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, air operations, and maintaining operational tempo after breakthroughs to prevent Germans from establishing new defensive lines. The Soviet forces assembled for the operation totaled approximately 2.5 million men organized in 4 front commands that would attack simultaneously across a front stretching approximately 500 miles from north of Vitebsk to south of Bobruisk. The First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration would attack north of Vitebsk toward Polotsk. The Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky would attack toward Vitebsk and then drive westward toward Vilnius. The Second Belarusian Front under General Georgy Zakharov would attack across the Dnieper River toward Mogilev and Minsk. And the First Belarusian Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky would attack from the south toward Bobruisk and then northwest toward Minsk to complete encirclement of German forces. The equipment assembled for the offensive included approximately 5 E-200 tanks and self-propelled guns, 31,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and 5 E-300 aircraft, creating overwhelming superiority over German forces that possessed approximately 900 tanks, 9,500 artillery pieces, and 1,300 aircraft scattered across the entire Eastern Front. The deception operations conducted during May and June 1944 to mislead German intelligence about Soviet intentions were among the most sophisticated of the entire war. Soviet forces in Ukraine conducted conspicuous preparations, suggesting imminent offensives, including concentration of dummy tanks constructed from wood and canvas, increased radio traffic suggesting major headquarters moving into forward areas, and reconnaissance activities indicating preparation for attacks. In the Baltic region, similar deception measures created impressions of impending attacks that drew German attention and reserves away from Belorussia, where actual Soviet preparations were being conducted under strict camouflage discipline. Units moved into assembly areas primarily during darkness, remained concealed during daylight under camouflage netting, and maintained radio silence that prevented German radio intelligence from detecting the massive concentration occurring. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, believed based on intelligence assessments that Soviet summer offensives would occur primarily in Ukraine, where terrain was more favorable for large-scale armored operations than the forests and marshes of Belorussia. The German High Command reinforced this belief by transferring significant armored divisions from Army Group Center to Army Group North Ukraine, leaving Army Group Center with minimal mobile reserves that could counterattack Soviet breakthroughs. The transfers included the 20th Panzer Division, the 18th Panzergrenadier Division, and several other mobile formations, leaving approximately 800,000 German troops defending the Belarusian salient, with virtually no armored reserves and no significant forces available for counteroffensive operations if Soviet attacks achieved penetrations. Hitler's fortified place strategy compounded German vulnerability by designating Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Bobruisk as feste Plätze that were to be held regardless of circumstances, even if surrounded, with garrison commanders being personally responsible to Hitler for executing these orders. The concept reflected Hitler's belief that determined defenders could hold positions indefinitely if properly supplied by air, drawing on the Demyansk pocket example from 1942. But the concept ignored realities about modern mobile warfare in 1944, about what happened when enemy mechanized formations penetrated into rear areas, while enemy air superiority prevented effective aerial resupply, and about differences between holding a pocket for months while relief operations were organized versus holding indefinitely when no relief was possible. Lieutenant General Kurt von Tippelskirch, commanding the German Fourth Army in the central sector between Orsha and Mogilev, reviewed intelligence reports on June 22 that suggested increased Soviet activity, but provided no clear indication whether Soviets were preparing for major offensive operations or conducting routine movements. Tippelskirch had commanded in the East since 1941 and had extensive experience reading Soviet intentions, but the reports were contradictory, with some indicators suggesting imminent attacks, while others suggested Soviet forces were in defensive postures. The intelligence officers serving with Army Group Center operated under explicit guidance from higher headquarters that Soviet main summer offensive would occur in Ukraine, making it difficult to present assessments suggesting major attacks might occur against Army Group Center when such assessments contradicted what superiors expected. The Soviet offensive began in pre-dawn darkness on June 23, 1944. With reconnaissance in force operations where specially trained assault groups probed German positions to identify weaknesses and confirm that defensive positions were where Soviet intelligence believed them to be. The reconnaissance operations, conducted by infantry supported by engineers who cleared paths through minefields using mine detectors and Bangalore torpedoes, achieved surprise in many sectors, because German defenders were not expecting attacks before a major bombardment. The assault groups penetrated German forward positions before dawn, moving through darkness to approach trenches without being detected, until close enough to assault with grenades and automatic weapons. The groups captured prisoners who were immediately interrogated, providing information about German unit identifications, defensive preparations, and morale. The artillery bombardment commenced at 500 hours on June 23rd, when Soviet artillery opened fire with intensity that overwhelmed German defensive positions through sheer volume of explosives. The bombardment employed all calibers from 203 mm howitzers positioned miles behind Soviet lines to 82 mm mortars close to front lines, with Katyusha, multiple rocket launchers employed at critical breakthrough points. Soviet gunners had registered weapons during previous weeks by firing occasional harassing missions that collected range and direction data for targets without suggesting major operations were imminent. The bombardment's effects varied depending on fortification quality, with positions having overhead cover and deep dugouts surviving better than open trenches. But even the best fortifications could be destroyed by direct hits from heavy artillery. German communication systems depending on telephone lines were systematically destroyed within minutes, severing contact between forward units and headquarters, and preventing commanders from understanding what was happening or coordinating defensive responses. The loss of wire communications forced Germans to rely on radio, but Soviet jamming interfered with German networks. The psychological effects of continuous bombardment affected even veterans, with intensity exceeding anything most had experienced at Stalingrad, Kursk, or during 1943 defensive fighting. Soldiers sheltering in bunkers experienced terror of waiting in darkness while earth shook, dust-filled bunkers making breathing difficult, and explosion sounds merged into continuous roar, making communication impossible. The infantry assault following the bombardment saw Soviet rifle divisions advancing behind closely coordinated artillery fires that lifted from one German trench line to the next in synchronized timing, allowing Soviet infantry to advance close behind the barrage and reach German positions before defenders could man weapons. The tactics reflected lessons learned through years of costly experience, with coordination between artillery and infantry representing dramatic improvement over earlier attacks where poor coordination resulted in Soviet infantry advancing without support or arriving long after artillery lifted. Soviet infantry advancing through smoke and dust from the bombardment encountered German defenders emerging from bunkers, disoriented and deafened by bombardment, attempting to man machine gun positions and organize defensive fires against waves of Soviet soldiers moving toward them. Private Ivan Kozlov, a rifleman in the 5th Guards Rifle Division attacking German positions east of Vitebsk, advanced in the first assault wave carrying his PPSH submachine gun and wearing the gymnasterka tunic and Pilotka side cap that identified him as a Soviet soldier. Kozlov had joined the Red Army in 1943 after his village in Ukraine was liberated from German occupation, motivated by rage at what Germans had done to his family and neighbors during 2 years of occupation. He had fought in several smaller operations during spring 1944, gaining combat experience that taught him how to move under fire, how to identify German positions by muzzle flashes and by tracers, and how to survive in an environment where death came randomly and suddenly from artillery, from snipers, from machine guns, or from any of 1,000 ways that war found to kill soldiers. The assault across no man's land toward the German trenches required crossing approximately 300 yards of open ground that had been cratered by the UDR bombardment and that was covered with shell holes, destroyed obstacles, and unexploded ordnance that could detonate if stepped on. Kozlov ran in short bursts, dropping into shell holes when German machine gun fire swept across his section of the advance, then rising and running again when fire shifted to other targets. The soldier running beside him was hit by machine gun fire and fell without a sound, his body crumpling into a shell hole where he lay motionless. Kozlov kept running, understanding that stopping to help wounded comrades would get him killed and would not save the wounded man who was either dead already or beyond immediate help. The German machine gun position firing on Kozlov's section was located in a concrete pillbox that had survived the bombardment, its gun firing through an aperture that provided protection for the crew while allowing them to engage Soviet infantry across a wide arc. The gun was an MG-42, the weapon that Soviet soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw, for its extremely high rate of fire that could cut down entire squads in seconds if they were caught in the open without cover. The German gunner was methodically traversing the weapon back and forth across the Soviet advance, firing bursts that raised geysers of dirt when bullets hit the ground and that made distinctive ripping sounds when bursts passed overhead. Kozlov could see tracers arcing toward him and could see the muzzle flash from the pillbox aperture approximately 50 yards ahead. A Soviet tank supporting the infantry advance, a T-34-85 with its 85mm gun, fired a high explosive shell at the pillbox from a range of perhaps 200 yards, the shell striking the concrete beside the aperture and detonating in a flash of orange fire and black smoke. The explosion didn't penetrate the pillbox, but the concussion stunned the crew inside, and the machine gun stopped firing for perhaps 30 seconds while the crew recovered. Kozlov used those seconds to sprint the remaining distance to the pillbox, reaching the blind spot directly beneath the aperture where the gun could not depress enough to engage him. He pulled a grenade from his belt, a F-1 defensive grenade nicknamed Limonka for its pineapple shape, pulled the pin and threw it through the aperture into the pillbox. The explosion inside was muffled by the concrete but deadly for the crew, and the machine gun fell silent permanently. The breakthrough at Vitebsk demonstrated Soviet operational planning effectiveness and catastrophic consequences of Hitler's fortified place strategy. Soviet forces attacked Vitebsk from multiple directions simultaneously, the First Baltic Front striking from the north and the Third Belarusian Front attacking from east and south, creating coordinated envelopment that trapped German forces before they could withdraw. The German Ninth Army commander had requested permission to evacuate Vitebsk before the offensive began, recognizing the city's salient position made it vulnerable to encirclement. But Hitler refused and reinforced the garrison with additional troops who would be trapped when Soviet forces closed the encirclement on June 25th. General Friedrich Gollwitzer commanded the German forces at Vitebsk, approximately 35,000 troops from the 206th Infantry Division, the 4th Luftwaffe Field Division, and other units that had been designated as the Vitebsk garrison. Gollwitzer understood by June 24th that Soviet forces were enveloping the city from north and south, and that the corridor connecting Vitebsk to German lines to the west was rapidly being cut by Soviet mobile forces. He requested permission to break out while escape was still possible, but Hitler's headquarters refused, ordering Vitebsk held as a fortified place that would tie down Soviet forces. Gollwitzer's staff officers calculated that the garrison had ammunition for perhaps 5 days of intense combat, food for perhaps 2 weeks if rationed strictly, and that aerial resupply would be needed immediately if the garrison was to hold for any extended period. The Luftwaffe attempted to supply the Vitebsk pocket by air, using Ju-52 transport aircraft flying from airfields in Lithuania and East Prussia, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire made the missions extremely dangerous and shot down numerous transports before they could deliver their cargoes. The supplies that did reach Vitebsk were insufficient to sustain the garrison's combat operations, with ammunition consumption during defensive fighting exceeding delivery rates by factors of 5 or 10 to 1. By June 26th, German artillery units were rationing shells to a few rounds per gun per day. Machine gun crews were being ordered to fire only when targets were certain, and rifle ammunition was being distributed on the basis of 5 rounds per man per day, amounts completely inadequate for defending against Soviet attacks being launched continuously from all directions. The German breakout attempt from Vitebsk began on the night of June 26-27, when Gollwitzer, recognizing that the garrison would be destroyed if it remained in the pocket, ordered a breakout toward German lines approximately 15 miles to the west without authorization from higher headquarters. The breakout force consisted of approximately 8,000 troops, the fittest and best armed men from the garrison, organized into a column that would attempt to fight through Soviet encirclement during darkness when Soviet observation would be limited. The troops left behind, approximately 27,000 men, including wounded who could not march, and units designated to provide covering fire for the breakout, understood they were being abandoned but accepted this as necessary if anyone was to escape. The breakout column advanced westward along the Vitebsk-Ostrovno road, moving in darkness through forests where Soviet positions were known to exist, but where exact locations were uncertain. The Germans encountered Soviet blocking positions approximately 3 miles from Vitebsk, where a Soviet rifle regiment had established defensive positions across the road, supported by anti-tank guns and machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The German assault on these positions, conducted by troops advancing in column formation rather than deployed for combat, was repulsed with heavy casualties, with Soviet machine guns firing into packed German formations that had no room to deploy in the narrow forest road. The Germans attempted to bypass the Soviet positions by moving through forests off the road, but the darkness and unfamiliar terrain caused units to become disorganized and separated. By dawn on June 27th, the breakout column had penetrated approximately 5 miles from Vitebsk, but had lost cohesion, with different groups scattered through forests attempting to continue westward while Soviet forces were converging on the area and establishing new blocking positions ahead of the German advance. Soviet aircraft began attacking German groups as soon as daylight allowed identification of targets, with Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft firing rockets and cannon at German columns visible on roads or in clearings. The breakout attempt continued through June 27th, with diminishing success as Soviet forces systematically located and destroyed German groups, until by June 28th only small parties of Germans were still attempting to reach German lines, moving at night and hiding during day. Approximately 1,500 Germans from the original breakout force of 8,000 successfully reached German lines, exhausted, without heavy weapons, and with many wounded. The remaining Germans from the breakout force were killed or captured, with Soviet forces taking approximately 4,000 prisoners from groups that surrendered when further resistance became impossible. The garrison left behind in Vitebsk, approximately 27,000 men, surrendered on June 27th after exhausting ammunition and after Soviet forces penetrated into the city from multiple directions. The total German casualties at Vitebsk exceeded 33,000 killed or captured, representing the complete destruction of the garrison and the elimination of a significant portion of Army Group Center's combat strength. The pattern established at Vitebsk was repeated at Bobruisk, where Soviet forces from the 1st Belarusian Front under General Rokossovsky encircled approximately 40,000 German troops from the 9th Army, creating another fortified place pocket that Hitler ordered defended, but that Soviet forces methodically destroyed. The encirclement at Bobruisk was completed on June 27th, when Soviet mobile forces advancing from northeast met forces advancing from southeast, trapping German units that had been ordered to hold the city as a fortified place. The German commander at Bobruisk, General Gotthard Hofmeister, found himself in command of a pocket containing 5 divisions that were supposed to tie down Soviet forces, but that lacked the supplies or the defensive positions needed to hold for more than a few days. The terrain around Bobruisk was particularly difficult for defenders, with the city located on the Berezina River and surrounded by forests and marshes that provided cover for attacking Soviet forces while limiting fields of fire for German defenders. Soviet forces attacked the pocket from all directions simultaneously on June 28th, using infantry supported by tanks and artillery to compress the perimeter while preventing Germans from establishing coherent defensive lines. The German artillery, which had been a significant factor in previous defensive battles, was largely ineffective at Bobruisk because ammunition stocks were low and because Soviet air attacks destroyed gun positions when they revealed themselves by firing. The German breakout attempt from Bobruisk began on June 28th, when Hofmeister, like Gollwitzer at Vitebsk, recognized that remaining in the pocket meant certain destruction and ordered a breakout without authorization from higher headquarters. The breakout was complicated by the Berezina River, which the Germans would have to cross under fire, with the bridges having been destroyed by Soviet artillery, and with Germans being forced to ford the river or to construct improvised rafts. The breakout force numbered approximately 25,000 troops, organized into several columns that would attempt to break through Soviet positions south of Bobruisk, where intelligence suggested Soviet defenses were weakest. The breakout columns advanced toward the Berezina during the night of June 28-29th, moving through forests under constant harassment from Soviet patrols and from Soviet artillery firing on likely German routes. The columns reached the river around midnight and began crossing using any available means, including swimming, wading through shallows, and using logs and debris as improvised rafts. Soviet forces positioned on the far bank opened fire on Germans in the water, creating scenes of horror as men were shot while helpless in the current, as overloaded rafts capsized, drowning their occupants, and as wounded men clung to debris, attempting to stay afloat while currents swept them downstream. Approximately 15,000 Germans succeeded in crossing the Berezina during the night, leaving behind approximately 10,000 who were killed during the crossing or who were captured when Soviet forces overran their positions before they could reach the river. The Germans who crossed continued attempting to break through Soviet positions on the far bank, but Soviet forces had reinforced blocking positions during the night, and the exhausted Germans lacked the strength to penetrate organized defenses. The breakout attempt collapsed on June 29th, when the remaining organized German formations surrendered after being surrounded in forests approximately 5 miles from the river, having advanced that far but being unable to continue against fresh Soviet units moving into blocking positions. The total German casualties at Bobruisk exceeded 38,000 killed or captured, with only approximately 2,000 Germans from the original garrison successfully reaching German lines. The pocket that had been intended to tie down Soviet forces for weeks had been reduced in 3 days, with Soviet forces capturing intact much of the Germans' heavy equipment that had been abandoned during the failed breakout attempt. The rapid reduction of the Bobruisk pocket freed Soviet mobile forces to continue advancing westward toward Minsk, creating a race between Soviet exploitation forces and retreating German units attempting to establish new defensive lines before Soviet tanks arrived. The Soviet exploitation forces, pouring through gaps created by breakthrough operations, advanced with remarkable speed toward Minsk, the capital of Belorussia, and the key communications center through which German supply lines and withdrawal routes passed. Soviet Tank Corps and Mechanized Corps, the mobile formations held back during initial breakthrough operations, advanced along multiple axes in late June 1944, with lead elements covering 30 to 50 miles per day when German resistance collapsed and roads were clear. The commanders of these mobile formations operated under orders to maintain maximum speed, to bypass German positions that could not be quickly overcome, to seize key terrain including river crossings and road junctions before Germans could organize defenses, and to cut German supply lines by reaching deep into German rear areas. Major General Pavel Rotmistrov commanded the 5th Guards Tank Army advancing toward Minsk from the south, leading approximately 500 tanks and self-propelled guns organized in 3 tank corps that represented the most powerful Soviet mobile force committed to Operation Bagration. Rotmistrov had commanded tank armies during previous operations, including the Battle of Kursk in 1943. Where his forces had suffered heavy casualties during armored engagements with German Panzer divisions, but had ultimately helped defeat the German offensive. The experience at Kursk had taught Rotmistrov valuable lessons about employing tank armies effectively, including the importance of reconnaissance to identify German positions before committing main forces, the necessity of coordinating tank operations with infantry and artillery, rather than sending tanks forward unsupported, and the need to maintain operational tempo by bypassing strong points rather than becoming fixed in attritional battles. The 5th Guards Tank Army's advance toward Minsk encountered scattered German resistance from units attempting to establish blocking positions but lacking the strength or the heavy weapons to seriously delay Soviet mobile forces equipped with T-34 tanks that could destroy most German defensive positions through direct fire. The German units attempting to block Soviet advances consisted primarily of infantry remnants from divisions that had been shattered during the initial breakthrough, battles supported by a few anti-tank guns and perhaps an occasional assault gun or tank that had survived the retreat from forward positions. These forces could inflict casualties on advancing Soviet units, but could not prevent Soviet armor from bypassing positions and continuing westward, leaving German infantry to be dealt with by Soviet rifle divisions following the mobile forces. The German 4th Army defending the central sector of Army Group Center's front between Orsha and Mogilev found itself in an impossible situation by June 26th, when Soviet forces had broken through on both flanks and were advancing toward Minsk in the Army's rear, while Soviet forces attacking from the east were pushing German forces back from prepared defensive positions. General von Tippelskirch, commanding 4th Army, understood that his army would be encircled if it remained in current positions, but he lacked authorization to withdraw and lacked mobile forces that could conduct fighting withdrawal while maintaining unit cohesion. Tippelskirch requested permission to withdraw westward on June 26th, but Hitler and the High Command initially refused, believing 4th Army could hold its positions and that German counterattacks would restore the situation. The authorization to withdraw was finally granted on June 28th, 2 days after Tippelskirch requested it, and at a point when Soviet mobile forces had already advanced far to the west and were cutting routes of withdrawal. The Fourth Army began withdrawing on June 28-29, with units attempting to move westward along roads that were already under Soviet artillery fire and that were being bombed by Soviet aircraft. The withdrawal rapidly degraded into a retreat as units lost contact with higher headquarters, as logistics collapsed, preventing supplies from reaching frontline units, and as Soviet tanks appeared on flanks and in rear areas, forcing German columns to deploy for combat rather than continuing organized movement westward. By June 30th, the Fourth Army had disintegrated as an organized force, with divisions and regiments being reduced to battalion and company-sized groups, attempting to escape westward while being harassed continuously by Soviet mobile forces and by partisan groups that had been operating behind German lines throughout the occupation and that now emerged to attack retreating German columns. The partisans, organized into brigades and battalions under coordination from Soviet headquarters, struck German supply columns, ambushed German units moving along forest roads, and blocked German withdrawal routes by destroying bridges and by felling trees across roads at locations where Germans could not easily bypass the obstacles. The encirclement of Minsk was completed on July 3rd when Soviet forces from the Third Belarusian Front, advancing from the northeast, met forces from the First Belarusian Front, advancing from the southeast at Stolpci, approximately 40 miles west of Minsk, trapping approximately 105,000 German troops from Fourth Army and from remnants of other units. The pocket stretched approximately 40 miles from east to west and 30 miles from north to south, containing German forces that still possessed combat capability and that attempted to organize defensive perimeters while preparing breakout attempts toward German lines that were now approximately 60 miles to the west. The German High Command ordered the surrounded forces to hold positions and tie down Soviet forces while new defensive lines were established, repeating the fortified place strategy despite catastrophic failures at Vitebsk and Bobruisk. Colonel General Kurt von Tippelskirch, the senior German officer in the Minsk pocket after Fourth Army headquarters staff had been captured, attempted to organize the trapped forces for a coordinated breakout that would maximize chances of penetrating Soviet encirclement. Tippelskirch's staff officers calculated that successful breakout would require concentrating forces at a single point rather than attempting multiple breakouts that would dilute German strength, would require abandoning all heavy equipment that would slow movement, and would require night movement to minimize exposure to Soviet air attacks. The breakout was planned for the night of July 5th to 6th, with the attack being directed westward toward the town of Molodechno, where Tippelskirch believed Soviet defenses might be weaker than in other directions. The reduction of the Minsk pocket consumed 2 weeks of intense fighting, during which Soviet forces systematically compressed German perimeter through attacks supported by overwhelming artillery fires and airstrikes, while German forces attempted breakouts that achieved limited success. Soviet tactics for reducing pockets had been refined through experience at Stalingrad and at the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket during early 1944, with the emphasis being on preventing German forces from breaking out while systematically destroying organized resistance through artillery bombardment and infantry assaults supported by armor. Soviet forces surrounded the pocket, established continuous lines to prevent German escapes, brought forward heavy artillery that could engage German positions from positions outside the pocket's range, and coordinated airstrikes that destroyed German concentrations and command posts identified through aerial reconnaissance. The German breakout attempt from the Minsk pocket began on the night of July 5th, when approximately 60,000 German troops organized into a column assaulted Soviet positions west of the pocket, attempting to break through toward German lines. The breakout force advanced in darkness through forests, moving in column formation along forest trails that provided some concealment from Soviet observation, but that also channeled German movement into predictable routes where Soviet forces had established blocking positions. The lead German units encountered Soviet defensive positions approximately 5 miles from the pocket's edge, with Soviet infantry supported by anti-tank guns and tanks firing into the German column from prepared positions. The fighting during the breakout attempt continued for 3 days, as German forces attempted to penetrate Soviet positions while Soviet reinforcements moved into blocking positions, and while Soviet artillery and airstrikes attacked German columns. The German advance achieved penetrations of Soviet lines at several points, with small groups of Germans breaking through and continuing westward, but the majority of the breakout force became fragmented and dispersed through forests as Soviet forces contained the main German efforts. By July 8th, the breakout attempt had clearly failed, with organized German resistance collapsing as units exhausted ammunition and as casualties mounted to levels where continuing to fight became impossible. The final German resistance in the Minsk pocket ended on July 11th, when the last organized formations surrendered after being compressed into a small area approximately 10 miles across, and after running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Soviet forces captured approximately 57,000 German prisoners from the pocket, with an additional 48,000 German troops having been killed during the encirclement and reduction operations. The destruction of Fourth Army and the elimination of the Minsk pocket represented the complete destruction of a major portion of Army Group Center's combat power and created a gap in German defenses that Soviet forces would exploit through continued advances westward. The continuation of Soviet offensives beyond Minsk demonstrated that Operation Bagration was not simply an operation to liberate Belorussia, but was a strategic offensive designed to advance Soviet forces as far west as possible while German forces remained disorganized. Soviet forces advancing from Minsk drove toward Vilnius in Lithuania and toward the Polish border, advancing approximately 350 miles from their starting positions in 3 weeks. The Third Belarusian Front under General Chernyakhovsky advanced northwest toward Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital that was a major communication center controlling routes toward East Prussia. The First Belarusian Front under General Rokossovsky advanced southwest toward Brest and toward the Bug River that marked the pre-war Polish-Soviet border. The advance toward Vilnius encountered German resistance from units that had been rushed from other sectors to establish defensive positions blocking Soviet advances toward the Baltic states and toward East Prussia. The German forces defending Vilnius included remnants of divisions that had escaped from Belorussia, and several divisions transferred from Army Group North that had been defending positions in the Baltic states. These forces established defensive positions around Vilnius, utilizing the city's buildings and the surrounding terrain to create strong points, but they lacked the strength to hold against Soviet forces, attacking with overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower. The battle for Vilnius began on July 7th, when lead elements of the Third Belarusian Front reached the city's outskirts and immediately attacked German positions without pausing to consolidate or to conduct extensive reconnaissance. The Soviet tactics reflected the emphasis on maintaining operational tempo, with commanders being ordered to continue advancing and to seize objectives quickly, rather than allowing Germans time to strengthen defenses. The fighting in Vilnius continued for 6 days as Soviet forces fought through the city street by street, with German defenders establishing strong points in stone buildings that could withstand Soviet tank fire and that required infantry assault to reduce. The fall of Vilnius on July 13th eliminated a major German defensive position and opened routes toward East Prussia, bringing Soviet forces to the borders of Germany proper for the first time since 1914. The psychological impact of Soviet forces reaching German borders was significant for both sides, with Soviet soldiers understanding they were about to enter enemy territory where they would avenge years of suffering that German invasion and occupation had inflicted on Soviet populations, and with German civilians in East Prussia understanding that Soviet revenge would likely be terrible when Soviet forces crossed the border. The advance toward the Vistula River and toward Warsaw represented the culmination of Operation Bagration's initial phase and demonstrated strategic consequences of Army Group Center's destruction. Soviet forces from the 1st Belarusian Front under General Rokossovsky advanced westward across Belorussia and into Poland during July 1944, covering distances that exceeded anything achieved during previous Soviet offensive operations. The advance reached the Bug River, the pre-war Soviet-Polish border, on July 18th, and Soviet forces immediately began forcing crossings without pausing to consolidate positions on the east bank. The crossings of the Bug River were conducted under fire from German positions on the western bank, with Soviet engineers constructing pontoon bridges while under artillery fire, and while Soviet infantry established bridgeheads using assault boats to ferry troops across. The German forces defending the Bug had been ordered to hold the river line and to prevent Soviet forces from establishing bridgeheads that could be exploited by Soviet armor. But German units defending the river were understrength remnants from divisions that had been shattered during earlier fighting, and they lacked the artillery and the reserves needed to destroy Soviet bridgeheads once established. By July 20th, Soviet forces had established multiple bridgeheads across the Bug and were expanding them through attacks supported by tanks that had crossed using the pontoon bridges. The Soviet exploitation forces continued advancing westward toward the Vistula River and toward Warsaw, covering the approximately 100 miles between the Bug and the Vistula in 10 days, despite German attempts to establish defensive lines at intermediate positions. The advance reached the Vistula in late July and established bridgeheads on the western bank at several locations, including positions near Magnezu and Puławy south of Warsaw. The advance toward Warsaw created a situation where Polish Home Army forces in the city believed that Soviet liberation was imminent, and that launching an uprising against German occupation would allow Poles to liberate their own capital before Soviet forces arrived, establishing Polish control of the city and creating political facts that would influence post-war arrangements. The Warsaw Uprising began on August 1, 1944, with approximately 40,000 Home Army fighters attacking German positions throughout the city, seizing control of several districts, and expecting that Soviet forces visible on the eastern bank of the Vistula would cross the river and support the uprising. The Soviet halt at the Vistula remains one of the most controversial aspects of Operation Bagration and of the entire Eastern Front campaign, with debate continuing about whether Soviet forces were exhausted after advancing 350 miles and needed time to consolidate and resupply before continuing operations, or whether Stalin deliberately halted the advance to allow German forces to destroy the Polish Home Army before Soviet forces entered Warsaw, eliminating potential opposition to Soviet control of post-war Poland. The Soviet forces that reached the Vistula in late July had advanced approximately 350 miles in 5 weeks, had fought continuously during that period, and had suffered casualties that reduced combat effectiveness of frontline units to perhaps 50 or 60% of authorized strength. The logistics challenges facing Soviet forces at the Vistula were substantial, with supply lines stretching hundreds of miles from railheads in Belarus and Ukraine to forward units in Poland, with many bridges having been destroyed requiring time-consuming river crossings, and with supply requirements exceeding transportation capacity, creating shortages of ammunition, fuel, and food at the front. Soviet tank units that reached the Vistula were operating on minimal fuel reserves. Soviet artillery units had exhausted much of their ammunition stockpiles during the breakthrough battles and the subsequent pursuit, and Soviet rifle divisions were under strength and exhausted after weeks of continuous combat and marching. The German forces defending Warsaw and the approaches from the east had been reinforced during late July, with divisions transferred from other sectors and with newly raised divisions sent from Germany, creating a defensive force stronger than anything Soviet forces had faced since the breakthrough battles in late June. The German reinforcements included several Panzer and Panzergrenadier, divisions equipped with tanks and assault guns that could counterattack Soviet bridgeheads, and German forces launched counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads south of Warsaw during early August that inflicted casualties and that prevented Soviet forces from expanding bridgeheads sufficiently to allow major forces to cross the Vistula. The destruction of the Warsaw Uprising by German forces during August and September 1944, while Soviet forces remained on the eastern bank of the Vistula, watching created lasting bitterness among Poles who believed Soviet forces could have supported the uprising, but chose not to for political reasons. The Home Army forces fighting in Warsaw requested assistance from Soviet forces, including artillery support, airstrikes against German positions, and attempts to cross the Vistula to relieve pressure on the uprising. But Soviet forces provided minimal assistance, and Stalin refused requests from Western allies to allow British and American aircraft to land at Soviet airfields after dropping supplies to Warsaw insurgents. The uprising was crushed by German forces in early October 1944, after 2 months of fighting that killed approximately 200,000 Polish civilians and fighters, and that destroyed approximately 85% of Warsaw's buildings. The casualties suffered by both sides during Operation Bagration reflected the operation's scale and intensity, with German casualties totaling approximately 450,000 to 500,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, representing the destruction of 28 of 34 divisions assigned to Army Group Center at the operation's beginning. Soviet casualties totaled approximately 180,000 killed and 590,000 wounded, heavy losses that reflected the intensity of fighting, but losses that the Soviet Union could sustain given enormous manpower reserves and the rate at which new formations were being created through mobilization of populations in liberated territories. The casualty ratio favored the Soviets by approximately 2-to-1 in total casualties, but the strategic consequences were even more favorable because German losses included entire divisions destroyed as organized formations, while Soviet losses were distributed across many divisions that remained combat effective despite casualties. The equipment losses during Operation Bagration similarly reflected the operation's scale, with Germans losing approximately 2,000 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, and enormous quantities of trucks and other equipment that were abandoned during encirclement battles or destroyed during retreats. Soviet equipment losses totaled approximately 2,900 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. But Soviet industrial production and Lend-Lease deliveries ensured destroyed equipment could be replaced quickly, while German losses could not be made good given deteriorating German industrial situation and competing demands from other fronts, including Normandy, where German forces were also suffering heavy equipment losses. The political consequences of Operation Bagration's success extended beyond immediate military results to affect German military leadership and Hitler's relationship with senior commanders. Field Marshal Busch was relieved of command on June 28 and replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who had a reputation for stabilizing desperate situations through aggressive tactics and through willingness to ignore Hitler's no-retreat orders when tactical circumstances demanded withdrawal. Model's appointment reflected recognition that Army Group Center's situation required a commander who could make difficult decisions quickly without waiting for approval from higher headquarters, but even Model's abilities could not reverse the catastrophic situation or restore Army Group Center's combat effectiveness after losses that destroyed the formation's organizational coherence. The assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944, occurred against the background of Operation Bagration's catastrophic defeats and reflected growing desperation among German officers who recognized Germany was losing the war and that Hitler's leadership was leading toward total destruction. The conspiracy that attempted to kill Hitler and establish a new government that would seek peace with Western allies drew many members from officers who had served on the Eastern Front and who understood the implications of defeats like Bagration for Germany's strategic position. The failure of the assassination attempt and brutal repression that followed eliminated many of the German army's most capable officers and ensured Hitler's control over the military would not be challenged again, regardless of how desperate Germany's situation became. The liberation of Belorussia from German occupation represented enormous humanitarian achievement given that German occupation had resulted in deaths of approximately 1.6 to 1.7 million Belarusian civilians through deliberate killings, through starvation from German food requisitions, and through deportation to labor in Germany. The discovery of the extent of German atrocities as Soviet forces liberated cities and villages hardened Soviet determination to continue the war until Germany was completely defeated and until German leadership was held accountable for war crimes. The liberation allowed Soviet authorities to begin reconstruction and to begin resettling populations displaced by 3 years of occupation and warfare. The strategic situation after Operation Bagration differed fundamentally from the situation before the offensive began. Soviet forces had advanced from positions inside pre-war Soviet borders to positions in Poland and Lithuania, bringing the Soviet Union to Germany's doorstep and creating possibility that Soviet forces might reach Berlin before Western Allied forces advancing from France could reach central Germany. The destruction of Army Group Center eliminated Germany's largest remaining concentration of military power on the Eastern Front and created a situation where Germany lacked mobile reserves sufficient to counter future Soviet offensives regardless of where those offensives might be launched. The timing of Bagration's success coinciding with Allied breakout from Normandy in late July created a two-front crisis where German resources were insufficient to stabilize either front. The operational lessons from Operation Bagration influenced Soviet planning for subsequent operations during autumn 1944 and winter 1945 that would advance Soviet forces into Poland, into the Baltic states, into the Balkans, and eventually into Germany itself. The coordination of multiple front operations attacking simultaneously across extended frontages to prevent Germans from concentrating reserves against any single threat became standard Soviet operational practice. The use of deception operations to mislead German intelligence about where main efforts would occur proved so successful during Bagration that similar campaigns preceded all subsequent major offensives. The emphasis on maintaining operational tempo after achieving breakthroughs became doctrine that Soviet forces applied during the Vistula-Oder operation in January 1945 and during the final advance on Berlin in April 1945. Operation Bagration represents the Soviet Union's greatest operational victory of World War II, measured by scale of forces involved, by distances advanced, by speed of advance, and by strategic consequences achieved. The operation destroyed Army Group Center as an effective fighting force, advanced Soviet forces approximately 350 miles westward, liberated Belorussia and major portions of Poland and Lithuania from German occupation, and created strategic conditions allowing subsequent Soviet offensives that would advance to Berlin and end the war in Europe. The operation demonstrated that by summer 1944, the Soviet military had developed operational capabilities matching or exceeding those of the German Wehrmacht, that Soviet forces could plan and execute complex multi-front operations requiring coordination of millions of troops and thousands of tanks and aircraft, and that Soviet commanders had learned through years of costly experience how to fight effectively against German forces that no longer possessed the qualitative or quantitative advantages that characterized German operations during 1941 and 1942.